But there is something about dictionaries, any dictionary, that we all should become familiar with. This is with any dictionary, which certainly includes Webster's Dictionary and even Strong's Dictionary, both of which I quote very heavily in my books. And what is that? It's that meanings themselves change or get updated over time. This is why a lot of times dictionaries will give more than a single meaning to a given word. As history itself teaches us, new meanings can be added to them as time progresses. However, and please understand this, the Bible's meanings themselves never change. Even if languages they get updated, the original biblical messages do not change. This is because God got it right the very first time around. And the only time we need an updated Bible is when earthen languages themselves change over time. And we have to keep up with these changes for people's sakes. And so we need new Bibles on the markets as this happens. But that also causes problems for us as well. Why? Well, as languages progress, there's a great possibility that it could cause the Bible to become more and more obscure in its original meanings for a more modern audience. This is another reason why I plan on having a book published in the near future, which will deal with Bible translations, which I'm going to call The Bible is Not a Buffet. And this is also why I use the 1828 public domain Webster's Dictionary for quotes and the 1890 public domain Strong's Dictionary, because the more dictionaries, the more they update, it is possible for original word meanings to get obscure more and more. Why? Because, again, certain English words do change, and the further we get away from the AD 1611 King James Bible's words' meanings, the more obscure and archaic it actually becomes to us. Is updating really a bad thing, though? Well, it depends on how the student will look at it, and of how important the King James Version is to them. What do I mean by that? Well, at least 80%, maybe even up to 90% of the King James Version Bible, which had a panel of up to 54 hand-picked, intelligent, scholaristic men working on that translation, is really the work of one single man who had lived nearly 100 years before, William Tyndale, the extraordinary, talented, gifted man of God. And a study on whom he was would benefit any reader of the English Bible, for surely his was the first official translation into English. Official? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But right now, let's view an explanatory note. All right, this explanatory note is called William Tyndale, the extraordinarily talented, gifted man of God. Now, I'm aware of what the KJV claims on its cover page, KJV, King James Version. I'm aware of what it claims on its cover page, that not only do the translators say that their version was newly translated out of the original tongues, but that it also said, and more accurately, I might add, that it was also with the former translations digitally compared and revised. These translations, one should know, were really only one, and that was William Tyndale's work from about 100 years beforehand, about AD 1535, who was the very first person to directly translate the Bible from the original languages into English, especially since John Wycliffe's version, circa AD 1390, which before Tyndale was the only complete English Bible in existence made into Proto-English, was merely translated from St. Jerome's Latin Vulgate of the late 4th century AD. The other translations that appeared between Tyndale and the KJV within that 100-year gap were also dominantly Tyndale translations as well. For those who translated them relied heavily upon his version. For further research on Tyndale's translation being a main influence, if not the main influence, for the King James Version, please see God's Secretaries, The Making of the King James Bible by Adam Nicholson, Perennial HarperCollins Publishers, 2004, especially on pages 221 through 225. Without trying to infringe on copyright issues here, I do want to at least quote Mr. Nicholson on page 224 when he says, "Far from burying Tyndale, the 1611 translators had actually honored him. They were quite explicit about their debt to the past. Not only so, but on page 220, when explaining that the King James Version panel try to put their task beyond his, as in advancing, not destroying, he says, what they did could not have been done without Tyndale." Also see Book of Fire, William Tyndale, Thomas More, and the Bloody Birth of the English Bible by Brian Moynihan, Abacus Publishing, 2011. And perhaps more especially, the works by David Daniel, who has been called the foremost modern authority on both William Tyndale and William Shakespeare. His works include Fresh Tyndale Old and New Testament Publications, or translations rather, 1992, Yale University. I say translations because he does it from the Old English into modern English. Again, 1992, Yale University. That was the Old Testament. In 1989, the New Testament. Very nice books, by the way. I recommend getting them if you can. His introductions and notes therein are very helpful. Also, David Daniel's own biography on Tyndale called William Tyndale, a Biography, 1994, Yale University. Found it a little heavy in the reading. Very thick book. A lot of information just packed right into it. Now let's quote Reader's Digest, The Bible Through the Ages, 1996, on page 308. "Tyndale's translations was the basis of all subsequent English Bibles. The Illustrated Guide to the Bible, Oxford University Press, 1998, on page 15, says, several complete English Bibles, all indebted to Tyndale, appeared in the reign of Henry VIII. Finally, God's Outlaw, the story of William Tyndale and the English Bible by Brian H. Edwards, Evangelical Press, 1988, of which I think that's the book that they made a B movie on. I say B movie because it's, bad acting and everything. And I haven't brought myself to watch it just yet because it looked like some bad acting in there. But I'll get around to it, though. Anyways, I have the book that goes with the movie. And they say it is rarely appreciated how heavily dependent upon Tyndale was every translation of the scriptures up to and including the authorized version of the King James Version. Okay. Now, I cannot over-exaggerate the importance of Tyndale's translation of the Bible, nor the extraordinary calling that God placed into this man's life to be his translator for the English language, a work that still, in this author's opinion, stands tall as a prototype Bible translation that all modern translations into English should depend upon and should be modeled after. In fact, we can go as far as to say that Tyndale was also responsible for legitimizing, if I can use that word, the English language itself, raising it from the murkiness of the common folk of the lower classes, placing this language on the grand scale that we see it today. It was against the law in Tyndale's own day to ever dare translate the Bible into any other language rather than Latin, and he was killed for his efforts. He was martyred. In a book called The Daring Mission of William Tyndale by Stephen Lawson, Ligonier Ministries, 2014, we read that Tyndale became the father of the modern English language. He shaped the syntax, the grammar, and vocabulary of the English language more than any man who ever lived, more than the author Geoffrey Chaucer, more than the playwright William Shakespeare, or the poets Percy, Shelley, and John Keats. Now, this idea is echoed by David Daniel in his biography called, again, simply William Tyndale, a Biography. On page 3, we read, "He made a language for England." When Shakespeare quotes the Holy Scripture, you can be sure that it's Tyndale. When the panel of the KJV completed its mission, we read Tyndale. So again, he was God's chosen man for the English translation, and also, again, all Bibles should take his example for their own. But unfortunately, not all of them do. That's another subject for my upcoming book on Bible translations. The Bible's not a buffet. For there's another translation tradition that's not Tyndale. And again, in this author's opinion, this other line of biblical translations is inferior. which actually damages God's pure word. So please stay tuned for my upcoming book on that subject. Again, the Bible's not a buffet. It's history, it's reliability. Now let's go back to the main part of the book. So anyways, a study on whom Tyndale was would benefit any reader of the English Bible, for surely his was the first official translation in English. Official? When we understand that he was the very first to translate from the original languages into English, and that he also put the English language onto the map for the world. Call me old-fashioned, but I truly believe that he was a man chosen by God to bring the Bible to the English-speaking people of the world in the first place. Okay, fine. But don't we need to update from his archaic words? Sure. It's called the King James Version. Well, isn't that also too archaic for a modern student of the Bible, even though it finally was thoroughly and completely polished by 1769, that's its present form? No, it's not. Why? Because it'll benefit the student much better to learn how to read Tyndale than for them to have no end of English translating. For they are not true translations, but are merely updates that can eventually obscure original meanings, like I was talking about. Of which thoughts, again, I'm going to cover with detail in my upcoming book on the Bible's not a buffet, its history, its reliability, where I'll also explain why the King James Version, Tyndale version from 1769, does not fall victim to obscuring as most other modern versions do. Mostly these other translations, or should I say, the translators themselves, they always start off with good intentions, but they end up messing these versions up much more than necessary and come out with a book that's really not God-breathed, especially when a lot of them don't even travel down the road of Tyndale's tradition of translating, i.e. they use different source text of Greek and Hebrew than what Tyndale got. As I had explained in previous books of mine, and as crazy it may sound to some of my readers, when the water all boils down to the surface, the King James / Tyndale 1769 Bible turns out to be the perfect English Bible translation for the English-speaking public. The most perfect version that English readers will ever see. Oh, so now I'm a King James Version only person. And now I believe that the King James Version was gift wrapped in heaven, and that it dropped down out of the sky onto the porch of the Protestant church with a big fluffy bow on top of it. Now let's not get silly with all of this. Like I said, when it all boils down to the end of the studying it all out, and after many particulars are worked out, this is what I have found to be the truth of the matter. All of which, and I'm going to say it again, it's going to be discussed in my aforementioned upcoming book on Bible translations, Bible's Not a Buffet, and of which I've already somewhat spoken on in my already published book, In the Beginning, It Was Spiritual from the Very Start, a road, however, that I will not be going down in this book, but will recommend my book In the Beginning for those who would like to see more immediately before I have a chance to publish that other book.